The dusty streets of Millerville had seen many strangers come and go, but none quite like the woman who stepped off the afternoon stagecoach that September day, while the townspeople expected another delicate flower seeking refuge in the frontier town. What they got instead would challenge everything they thought they knew about strength, courage, and what it truly meant to belong. The arrival of the sun hung low over the weathered buildings of Millerville as the weekly stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the general store. A small crowd had gathered, as they always did, curious to see what new faces might emerge from the dust-covered vehicle. The coach door swung open, and out stepped a woman unlike any they had seen before. Her name was Magnolia Grace, though she preferred simply Grace. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and strong hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her green dress, while well made, was clearly chosen for durability rather than fashion. She carried herself with quiet dignity, but even from a distance, the townspeople could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "I'll be," whispered Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, to her companion. "Look at the size of that one. Probably couldn't find a husband back east," came another voice from the small crowd. "Had to come all the way out here to try her luck." Grace heard the whispers. She had heard them all her life. In Cincinnati, where she had worked as a seamstress, the comments had been constant. Too tall, too strong, too much woman for any proper gentleman. The decision to answer the mail-order bride advertisement from Millerville had been born of desperation and a deep longing for acceptance. She clutched the worn letter in her hand, the one from Clayton Thorne, a local rancher who had written such kind words about wanting a strong woman who could handle frontier life. Now, standing in the dusty main street with curious eyes upon her, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The town's judgment as Grace made her way to the hotel where she was to wait for Clayton. The whispers followed her like shadows. She passed the saloon, where a group of cowboys lounged on the porch, their eyes tracking her every step. "That's one big filly," one of them drawled, causing the others to snicker. "Poor Clayton," another added. "He asked for a strong woman, but I don't think he meant a horse." Grace's cheeks burned, but she kept walking. She had learned long ago that responding only made things worse. The hotel clerk, a thin man with nervous eyes, stammered through the check-in process, clearly unsettled by her presence. "Mr. Thorne said he'd be by tomorrow morning," he managed, sliding the key across the counter with shaking hands. "Rooms upstairs, second door on the right." That evening, Grace sat by her window looking out at the town that was supposed to be her new home. The main street was quiet now, with only the occasional passerby hurrying along the wooden sidewalks. She could see the church at the far end of town, its simple steeple reaching toward the star-filled sky. A part of her wanted to take the next stagecoach back east, but where would she go? Her small savings had been spent on the journey west, and there was nothing waiting for her in Cincinnati but more of the same loneliness and rejection. Meeting Clayton the next morning dawned clear and bright. Grace had barely finished her simple breakfast in the hotel dining room when she heard the sound of boots on the wooden steps outside. The door opened, and a man stepped inside, removing his hat as he looked around the room. Clayton Thorne was not what Grace had expected. He was tall, yes, but lean rather than broad, with gentle brown eyes and prematurely gray hair. His clothes were clean but worn, and his hands bore the calluses of honest work. When his gaze found hers, he smiled, and Grace felt something inside her chest fluttered like a bird taking flight. "Miss Grace?" he asked, approaching her table with careful steps. "Yes," she replied, standing. Even sitting, she had been nearly as tall as the other diners, and now, standing, she towered over most of the room. She saw Clayton's eyes widen slightly, but there was no mockery in his expression, only surprise. "I'm Clayton Thorne," he said, extending his hand. "I'm pleased to finally meet you." His handshake was firm and warm, and Grace noticed that he didn't pull away quickly as most men did. Instead, he held her gaze steadily, as if he were trying to see past the whispers and judgments to the person beneath. "Perhaps we could take a walk," he suggested. "I'd like to show you around town, if you're agreeable." Grace nodded, gathering her shawl. As they left the hotel together, she was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them down the main street. Clayton seemed oblivious to the attention, pointing out various shops and introducing her to the people they met. Along the way, the challenge their peaceful walk was interrupted when they reached the town square, where a commotion had drawn a crowd. A wagon loaded with supplies had gotten stuck in a deep rut, and several men were struggling to free it. The wagon belonged to the widow Morrison, an elderly woman who ran a small farm outside of town. "Been at it for near an hour," someone called out, wheels wedged in tight. Grace watched as 4 men strained against the wagon's weight, their faces red with exertion. The wheel remained stubbornly stuck, and the men were beginning to argue about the best approach. "Maybe we should get more help," suggested one, "or wait for the blacksmith to bring his tools," offered another. Clayton stepped forward. "Mind if I lend a hand?" "All the help we can get," Thorne replied. Jake Morrison, the widow's son. "This old wagon's heavier than it looks." As Clayton joined the group of men, Grace found herself studying the situation. She had loaded and unloaded countless wagons during her time working at the shipping docks near her boarding house in Cincinnati. She could see immediately what the problem was and how to solve it, but she hesitated. Speaking up would only draw more attention to herself. The men made several more attempts, grunting and straining, but the wagon didn't budge. Grace watched Clayton's face grow flushed with effort, saw the frustration building in the group. The widow Morrison stood to one side, wringing her hands. "My late husband would have had that wheel free in no time," she murmured sadly. Something in the old woman's voice stirred Grace to action. She stepped forward, her voice clear and calm despite the trembling in her chest. "Excuse me," she said, "but you're approaching this wrong." The men stopped their efforts and turned to stare at her. Jake Morrison's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and Grace heard a few chuckles from the growing crowd of onlookers. "I beg your pardon," Miss Jake said with barely concealed amusement, "but I think we men can handle this." "I'm sure you can," Grace replied evenly, "but you're trying to lift the entire weight of the wagon instead of redistributing it. If you unload about half the supplies and stack them on the opposite side of the wagon bed, it will shift the balance point. Then, while 2 of you lift from the front, 1 person can easily guide the wheel out of the rut." The men exchanged glances, and Grace heard more whispers from the crowd. "Well now," said one of the cowboys from the saloon, "looks like we got ourselves a lady engineer." The comment brought laughter from several bystanders, but Clayton stepped forward, his expression serious. "That makes sense to me," he said quietly. "Grace, would you show us what you mean?" What happened next would be talked about in Millerville for years to come. Grace rolled up her sleeves and began organizing the men like a seasoned foreman. Under her direction, they unloaded half the supplies and redistributed the weight exactly as she had described. Then, with Clayton and Jake lifting from the front and Grace herself guiding the wheel, the wagon rolled free of the rut as easily as if it had been sitting on smooth ground. A moment of stunned silence fell over the crowd before the widow Morrison began clapping enthusiastically. "Magnificent," she declared, "absolutely magnificent." But the reaction from others was mixed. Some of the townspeople seemed impressed, while others appeared uncomfortable with what they had witnessed. Grace heard the whispers starting again, louder now. "It ain't natural. A woman knowing such things. What kind of lady has she been, working around wagons and such? Clayton's getting more than he bargained for, that's certain." Grace's heart sank. She had only wanted to help, but once again, her actions had set her apart from what was expected of a proper woman. She began to step back from the group, ready to retreat to the safety of the hotel, when Clayton's voice stopped her. "Grace," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That was remarkable. How did you know exactly what to do?" All eyes turned to them as Clayton waited for her answer. Grace felt the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her shoulders. She could give a safe, acceptable answer, or she could tell the truth and risk confirming every negative thing they were already thinking about her. She chose the truth. "I worked at the shipping docks in Cincinnati," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I loaded and unloaded freight wagons for 2 years after the seamstress shop closed. I learned that there's usually a smarter way to do things than just using brute force." The silence that followed was deafening. Grace could practically feel the disapproval radiating from the crowd. A proper lady didn't work at shipping docks. A proper lady didn't direct men in manual labor. A proper lady certainly didn't know more about wagons than the menfolk. Clayton looked around at the faces surrounding them, and Grace saw him taking in the reactions of his neighbors and friends. This was the moment, she realized, when he would have to choose between fitting in with his community and standing by the strange woman he had barely met. To Grace's surprise, Clayton began to smile. Not a polite social smile, but a genuine expression of admiration and something that looked remarkably like pride. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "I asked for correspondence with a strong woman who could handle frontier life. I believe I've found exactly what I was looking for." He turned to Grace, and the warmth in his eyes made her breath catch in her throat. "Grace," he continued, "I've been struggling to manage my ranch alone since my father passed. I need someone who isn't afraid of hard work, someone who can think on her feet and isn't too proud to get her hands dirty. I need someone with the strength to build a life with me in this sometimes harsh and unforgiving land. He paused, taking her large, capable hand in both of his. I don't need a delicate flower who will wilt at the first sign of trouble. I need exactly what you are, strong, intelligent, and unafraid to be yourself. If you're willing, I'd be honored to have you as my wife. The transformation. The crowd was dead silent as Grace looked into Clayton's face, searching for any sign that he was simply being kind or making the best of a difficult situation. What she saw there was sincerity, respect, and something that looked remarkably like love at first sight. Are you certain? She asked quietly, aware that everyone was listening. I'm not what most people consider suitable wife material. I'm too tall, too strong, and I have opinions about things that ladies aren't supposed to understand. Clayton's smile widened. Grace, I spent 3 years married to a woman who couldn't change a candle without help and fainted at the sight of a spider. She was everything this town considered proper and suitable, and she was miserable every day of our life together. She hated the ranch, hated the isolation, and eventually hated me for bringing her to such a place. His voice grew softer, but no less clear. I don't want suitable Grace. I want a partner. I want someone who can help me build something lasting and strong. I want you exactly as you are. The tears that Grace had been holding back finally spilled over. For the first time in her life, someone was not asking her to be smaller, quieter, or more conventional. Someone was asking her to be herself. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes, I'll marry you. Clayton Thorne. The wedding and new beginning. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small church at the end of Main Street. Grace had worried that no one would attend, given the mixed reaction to their engagement, but she was surprised to find the church nearly full. The widow Morrison sat in the front row, beaming like a proud grandmother. Even some of the men who had initially mocked her were present, their expressions respectful, if not entirely comfortable. Grace wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, altered to accommodate her tall frame without trying to hide it. Clayton wore his best suit, and when he looked at her walking down the aisle, his face lit up as if he were seeing the sunrise for the first time. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Clayton's kiss was gentle but certain, and Grace felt the last of her walls crumble away. The reception was held in the church hall, and Grace was surprised by how many people approached her with genuine congratulations. Mrs. Henderson, who had been among the first to whisper, actually apologized. I spoke hastily when you arrived, she admitted. I can see now that Clayton knows exactly what he's doing. You two are well suited. Epilogue. 6 months later, the spring sun was warm on Grace's back as she worked in the vegetable garden behind the ranch house. She had expanded it considerably since moving in, and the neat rows of green plants were already showing promise of a bountiful harvest. She heard the sound of hoofbeats and looked up to see Clayton riding in from the far pasture, a wide grin on his face. Behind him rode Jake Morrison and 2 other neighboring ranchers. Grace, Clayton called as he dismounted. We need your help. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to the group. What's the problem? Johnson's bridge washed out in the storm last night, Jake explained. We need to get the cattle across the creek to the summer grazing land, but the water's running too high and fast for the regular crossing. The men want to wait for the water to go down, Clayton added, but that could take weeks, and the cattle need that grass now. Grace studied the faces of the men, seeing the same trust and respect in their eyes that had taken months to earn. They weren't asking for her help because they couldn't think of alternatives. They were asking because they had learned that she often saw solutions that escaped others. Show me the creek, she said simply. An hour later, Grace stood on the bank of the swollen waterway. Clayton and the other ranchers gathered around her. She had spent 20 minutes studying the current, the terrain, and the behavior of the cattle. Now she pointed upstream to a bend in the creek where the water spread wide and shallow over a gravel bar. There, she said, the water's moving slower through that section because it's spread out. If we drive the cattle up that way and cross them in small groups, they'll have better footing and won't panic in the current. That's nearly a mile out of the way. One of the ranchers protested. Yes, Grace agreed, but it's better than losing cattle in the flood, or waiting 3 weeks for the water to recede. Clayton was already nodding. She's right. We'll try it Grace's way. The crossing took most of the day, but every single head of cattle made it safely to the other side. As the sun began to set, the group of ranchers gathered around Clayton and Grace to celebrate their success. Clayton, said Jake Morrison, raising his cup of coffee in a mock toast. You were right about what you needed. Clayton put his arm around his wife's shoulders and pulled her close. I sure was, he agreed, looking down at Grace with eyes full of love and pride. I needed exactly what I got. the strongest woman in 3 counties, and the smartest too. Grace leaned into her husband's embrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged, with people who valued her for who she truly was. The whispers and mockery seemed like echoes from another lifetime. She was no longer the woman who was too much of everything. She was simply Grace Thorne, exactly the right size for the life she had found in Miller.